author of The Bomb in America's Missile Age on Audible, which I'll put in the description, which is fantastic. And last time we talked, we kind of touched on towards the end, really the most fascinating.
And it's also available in typical book form from Johns Hopkins.
Beautiful. So it's a fantastic book for anyone that's interested in this. It's a fantastic listen. I loved how you kind of went into, not that this won't be the scope of this podcast, but how you went into all the business CEOs that were kind of poached to come into the government. That's all new information I had never learned before. But we did that last episode. We were just talking before this about, kind of what's getting you excited. And I thought the most interesting thing of what you just said was, there's always changes between administrations, obviously just left, right. I mean, from the dawn of America, and things always come to an abrupt change, and this is slashed and this is built, and then this is slashed and that's built and executive. But what you said is there's almost a seamless transition to how America is approaching, I guess, the space frontier. And what you said was it's this July will be 10 years since the space shuttle was retired, and anyone that pays attention knows that we've been hitching a ride on the Russian Soyuz. But you just said that's coming to end with a vengeance. But like I normally do, like an idiot, I have now been talking for 90 seconds without letting you say a word. So please introduce yourself to everyone that has not listened to our last episode.
Okay, I'm Christopher Gainor, and I'm the editor of Quest, the History of Spaceflight Quarterly. And I've written a few books about space exploration. Actually, the most recent one, even more recent than The Bomb of America's Missile Age, is one I've written about the Hubble Space Telescope under contract to NASA, and it's called Not Yet Imagined, a study of Hubble Space Telescope operations.
Well, and
the best thing about that book is that the electronic form is available free of charge from NASA. So
I just found it. Yeah, I'll put that in the description as well. Not Yet Imagined, a study of Hubble Space Telescope operations. Well, I just made a note of that, and that will be our next episode.
That's right. And the printed version of it hasn't come out yet, but I expect that will be happening shortly. But the ebook version has been available for a few months now, and it's because it's a NASA document, it's available free of charge.
Beautiful.
So that's exciting. But there's a lot of history of the shuttle program in there, because Hubble and shuttle were inextricably linked.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we can get into that in a few minutes. But
absolutely.
Just getting back to the point you were making at the beginning, we're kind of reaching an important point in the history of space exploration right now, especially for the U.S. space program, because the program has been kind of adrift for the last decade, ever since the shuttle program came to an end, and there's been shifting priorities between the various administrations. The administration of George W. Bush decided to end the shuttle program around 2010, and it came up with a program, I think they were calling it Constellation, that was to succeed it. And by the time 2010 came along, Barack Obama was president, the shuttle got a bit more of a lease on life, but it ended in July 2011. And by then, the Constellation program had been kind of, effectively blown up. And although parts of it were continuing on and still continue on because they have a lot of support in Congress, and that's the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft, which is still being built. And but the Obama administration really pressed for private space, and this is bearing fruit in the form of the Dragon spacecraft and the Falcon rocket from Elon Musk. Soon, about a month from now, Boeing is going to take another stab at launching its private spacecraft, which will also be sending crew and cargo to the International Space Station like Dragon does. Just one clarification, some of the work on the private space did get going under the George W. Bush administration, but it really got going under Obama. Now, Bush's space policy was kind of talking about going to the moon and Mars, but it wasn't all that clear. Obama, that administration actually thought, well, let's maybe think about going to an asteroid before we go back to the moon and Mars. And I personally actually like that idea, but I didn't have a lot of company. So anyway, that was all changed when Donald Trump became president, and Trump was quite interested in space policy relative to a lot of presidents, and he made what is generally acknowledged, regardless of one's political viewpoint, to have made a good choice for his NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, who was a congressman from Oklahoma, I believe. And so the Trump administration developed a space policy with the Artemis program, and Artemis being the sister of Apollo, with the target of sending people back to the moon. And that got a lot of buy-in from Congress. As well, Trump continued to encourage the private efforts that we're seeing with Elon Musk and Dragon and Boeing and all these other things. But I think this year is something of a milestone because there was a changeover in administration, and now we have President Biden in office. And while almost everywhere in the Washington landscape you see Trump policies and Trump people being thrown out or overturned, or the big exception to that is in the field of space. The new administrator of NASA, Bill Nelson, a former senator from Florida, former space shuttle participant, he was in the 80s too. A senator and a congressman flew on board the shuttle, and Bill Nelson was a congressman at the time and flew on the shuttle on the last mission before the Challenger disaster. And so and of course, Florida being the home of the Kennedy Space Center, he's always had a big interest in space. So he's now the administrator of NASA, and Artemis is going on. A lot of the policy administrations of the Trump period are going on. So America is headed back to the moon. And now Trump had hoped for that first landing to take place in 2024. I'm not sure it's going to happen that soon, but even if the Biden administration is a one-term administration, I think we'll be close enough to it at the end of that time, and so sometime in this decade we will see people back on the moon
by the end of the decade.
Yes, and amongst them will be the first woman on the moon.
Oh yeah,
that's been a big promise. So anyway, that's important. That there's now a direction to the space program that's being adhered to, even with a changeover in administrations.
I was going to ask you, as you're saying all this, do you think that there is some importance and perhaps, and I have no idea how it would be done. Obviously, it's very easy to sit here in an apartment and dictate how things should be with no experience in this, but I'll do it anyway. Is there some importance in perhaps establishing space programs that are almost untouchable by administrations, because the very nature of our political system, 4 to 8 years, is such that space doesn't care about political terms. It takes time. I mean, again, Kennedy, even if he was to live out his 2 terms, still, by his own definition, technically might not have seen the landing of on the moon by the end of this decade, right? So there's that sort of, it's the great quote, wonderful things can happen so long as no one cares about who gets credit. And now, is there importance in that? So we see with the space shuttle, like you said, intrinsically tied to the Hubble Space Telescope. There's a lot of great documentaries on that, on the size of the cargo and the shuttle bay door. And it's a civilian agency, but I mean, the NRO and the DoD, they got in there and they're like, you're going to do this because we got to do X, Y, and Z. And then we see with the creation of the Space Force, which again, I think was an apolitical win. We see the separation of the U.S. Army Air Forces from the Army in 1947 after World War II, because there's this is a new plane, no pun intended, of fighting. And then as throughout the Cold War, that kind of turned into Space Command, and we get the NRO, the National Geospatial Agency, to the point where, I mean, it makes sense that we leapfrog again, and we need kind of like the stages of a rocket. We have Army, Air Forces, Air Force, Space Force. Makes sense. I say all of that to say, is there an intrinsic benefit to military space programs because they transcend political administrations or regimes or whatever you want to call it? And can that be carried over into the civilian aspect of space exploration, to where it kind of seems like something that every politician can throw out? At least in my short life, I can remember it's we're going to go to Mars, and it's but anybody can say that, right? I can say Tommy's podcast, we're going to Mars, and Dr. Chris Gainor is going to be there with me, because I mean, no one's going to be able to hold it to us. And I know I'm kind of word salading right now, but do you think there's any benefit to that? Will the military always have an upper hand because, like an ICBM program or a nuclear sub program or an aircraft carrier program, they're untouchable? It's political suicide, so it doesn't matter who's in office. They get done anyway. Is there a benefit to that if the military says, for whatever reason, the DoD we're going to be on Mars by 2035, it doesn't matter if it's President Biden or President Gaynor, we're going to be there by 2035. Is there a benefit to sort of the military doing it? Or is that, I don't know, is that a slippery slope to, I don't know. I'm kind of word salading right now. What do you think?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts on that.
Sure.
The Space Force is another example of a Trump policy that's just gone unmolested, into the Biden era. Well, I think a big reason why America made it to the moon in the 1960s, as President Kennedy suggested, was because for much of that time, space was seen as civilian space, that is, was seen as a matter of national security. In the early years of the space race, late 50s, early 60s, the Russians were regularly beating the Americans. And I talk about the background of that in the Bomb in America's Missile Age. And back then, the United States was in this competition with the Soviet Union, and this was highly embarrassing to America's reputation to be regularly beaten. You know, the first satellite, the first dog, the first man, the first woman, blah blah blah, on and on it goes, being Soviet. So the solution was to go to the moon, and now by the time they got there, it was not being seen that way. So it was not being seen as such an urgent matter of security, because the world had moved on during that decade, and there were other priorities that were coming up. For example, it being the late 1960s, there was a lot of talk about or a lot of concern over civil rights, and as we're seeing again, the issue of poverty and things like this. So, but over and so later on in Apollo, the budgets were cut quite a bit. But the exception to that was in the military space program and national security space programs. And so by the time President Reagan took office, the money spent on military space programs was greater than that spent on civilian space programs. And that hadn't been the case for a number of years. And that's been the case ever since. There's been a lot of money spent on military space. For example, missile programs, missile defense programs, reconnaissance, GPS, which has massive civilian effects, comes out of the military budget and has military applications. So there's lots of stuff like that. But the important thing in the past few years is the rise of private space, in my view, because a lot of civilian space programs are seen as optional. You get the question, if we're sending people to the moon, why can't we spend it on this or devote more to that that priority, whichever thing concerns the speaker. And you don't hear that so much with other things like matters of national defense. So I would say that the fact that we're getting more private space efforts is kind of a way to get around issues like changing government priorities and changing administrations and things like that. So I think that's very important, and I think military space will just keep rolling on. In the early days of space, there was talk, whoever controls the moon controls space. I don't think that's widely believed, but certainly there's a lot of concern about low Earth orbit and also some of the higher Earth orbits, like, for example, where we have geosynchronous communication satellites and things like that. So, and that increasingly is becoming an arena for military operations. So what this means, though, is that people who are interested in traveling in space are not going to have to become astronauts. You'll be able to put down money, and of course, right now that's a very small group. But I think over time it will become a bigger group that will be able to afford to go into space. Soon there's going to be Dragon spacecraft and launched into orbit, funded privately. It's not going to be funded by NASA, and I think we're just a few months away from that now. And you mentioned earlier on, Jeff Bezos' flight in about 3 weeks from now, which is not going into orbit, but it's an up and down flight. We also have Sir Richard Branson, he's going to be sending up space tourists on up and down flights too. So it's going to be exciting, and it's not going to be subject to government whim. It'll just be like airlines. It'll be subject to government regulation, and it'll be based on the market. This also has implications for NASA. It means that NASA doesn't have to spend a lot of effort just, being kind of America's only gateway into space. They can kind of turn to exploration. So they will put more emphasis on Artemis and hopefully to some sort of program to Mars and beyond. Although, there's also talk from people like Elon Musk that he's going to be sending people to the moon and Mars too. So, and I think that's good. That's a positive thing too, because we still will have those people out there. Why should we be exploring space when we have this problem or that problem back on Earth?
Yeah. I guess that kind of answers my question, though, right? Yeah, to have an organization that transcends the limits and short lifetimes of political administrations, obviously is military, but yeah, it would be private, right? It would be it doesn't matter. It's private. They're going to go do, it'd be Apple saying we're going to release, Apple Silicon, we're going to release new MacBooks and new Mac Pros. It doesn't matter if Biden or Trump wins, right? I mean, obviously there's going to be effects with trade tariffs and raw materials and things, but do you think because you're right, the Soviets they were kicking our ass, right? They put up the first man, they put up the first dog, they put up Sputnik, and the importance of Sputnik wasn't that it was beeping, it was that they had the ability to launch an object into space, and that object could now be a thermonuclear weapon. And there was there was a terror to get to space, and as your book talks about, is there anything that could happen today that would be the same? And it's a shame that I feel like I'm like leaning back on it, but it is how humans work. Would there be a threat to say, if China started mining asteroids, could we look at that as a national security threat? Like, hey, they're going to have a monopoly on what are normally rare earth metals, and now they have, literal asteroids of whatever material they need, palladium or rhodium or something. Could that be seen, or is it going to be less of a military approach? Would it be more private, to where it's not just the limited number of people going to space now, and like you said, that's a very small group, but it will grow, just like cell phones, right? The first cell phones the size of suitcases versus now, me, Joe Schmo, I can have a touch screen. Is it going to be a drive to resources as opposed to like a luxury? Is it going to be ExxonMobil going, hey, there's the future of fuel? Is that going to, and not that you know the answer, not to put it all on your shoulders, but right. Is it going to be something? Is there a military competition that could take place, a legitimate, not just, hey, we're going to have a man on the moon, but is there a legitimate, like, hey, we have to beat China, just like the Soviets kind of embarrassed us? Or is there a legitimate private reason that will be more than just the token, hey, if you've got money to blow, you want to go to low Earth orbit? Will there be an actual incentive? Asteroid mining.
Well, the security environment in space is becoming a bit more complicated. I mean, Russia is still there, and really, when you look at it, except for one or two facts in the security area, Russia is a second-rate power. And the main reason why it has to be taken really seriously is because it still has all these nuclear weapons and nuclear forces that can also be projected into space. So, but otherwise, its economy and everything else are way behind the United States and China and other places. So, but of course, the major development in the last few years has been the rise of China. It's building up its forces. It's becoming more aggressive. There could be some major confrontations involving China, particularly over Taiwan. And China has, for example, demonstrated that it has an anti-satellite weapon, and so if there was ever a military conflict, God forbid, between the United States and China, it would also take place in space. And but China is also showing its prowess in space. It's recently orbited a space station. It's actually its second space station. It's actually quite similar to the Soviet and Russian space stations that we had in the past, but the fact they have it says something. And then, of course, they've done things like make the first landing on the far side of the moon, and now they've joined the very exclusive club of countries that have landed a spacecraft on Mars and have a rover operating on Mars. And just the other day, they sent back some remarkable film, which is quite similar to what we saw from Perseverance earlier this year. So, they're still behind the United States in a lot of those things, but they're catching up, and they are talking about, sending their taikonauts, as we call them, to places like the moon, and China is becoming a big factor, and it's a matter of a lot of concern in military circles.
Yeah, so right. It's objects in the rearview mirror are closer than they appear. Right? They're.
That's right, and China is aggressively, trying to establish itself as the preeminent power in the world through kind of hard influence, projecting military power, but also diplomatically, which was kind of the issue that was going on back when the Soviet Union was ahead in space. It's going to places like Africa and elsewhere, and elsewhere in Asia, saying, well, we're the rising power in the world, so why don't you be our friends rather than those Americans? So
yeah, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly.
It feels like we're going through, or if we're not already in, a Cold War too. I just had something pop in my. So I've had on this podcast 3 times before Charlie Duke, 10th man to walk on the moon, and he had a great quote in one of the speeches I saw him give, and it was like you said, there are a lot of parallels between the 60s and now, right? It seems like every time we get ready to go to space, right, there's a lot, right? Getting ready to go to space, we have a rising power that we could go into a Cold War with insane civil civil rights disturbances and an unpopular war, right? It seems they're all kind of, right, Vietnam and it's all Iraq, it's all coming together. What Mr. Duke said is, he said a lot of people didn't like the idea of the Apollo program when we had things like LBJ saying we need to have the Great Society. We have all these troubles at home. And why did we spend $130 billion going to the moon? And why do we spend that money on the moon? And Charlie Duke said, we didn't spend a penny on the moon. We spent it in the United States. Like, there were jobs. There were jobs created. There was wealth created. There was trickle-down technology. Could that kind of dynamic be seized again instead of, hey, why are we going to Mars when we don't have, we have 40 million Americans without health care? Could that be seized? Could there be a benefit to everyone to kind of posturing with China? Do you think? And again, not that you know the answer and not to throw that on your shoulders.
Yeah, well, that's, I agree with what Charlie Duke says, that all that money is spent back on Earth. And there was a lot of important knowledge gained from space. Thanks to our flights to the moon, we actually have a lot better idea of what the history of the Earth was going way back. A lot of the problems we're going to be facing going forward are environmental problems. Well, we learned a lot about those by our exploration of Venus, which you never hear much about. But actually, NASA this year has announced that they're going to be sending more spacecraft to Venus. But on that planet, we saw the greenhouse effect and what it had done to that planet. And of course, that was a bit of a prelude to us learning about climate change on Earth. Mm-hmm. So there's issues like that. Another thing that I say is that during Apollo, the budget of NASA really grew greatly. It was, say, at the time President Kennedy took office, it was like less than 1% of the federal budget. And by the time it reached its height in the mid-60s, it was about 4% of the budget. And but as soon as Apollo landed, it was cut back, and it's been around a half a percentage point of the federal budget, or certainly less than 1% of the federal budget. So it was effectively cut in four, and I say, well, did all that money really solve the problems that people hoped it would? And I would say that that's not the case, because when there's reporting about spaceflight, there's always the price tag, that this flight cost $1 billion or that satellite cost $250 million, and people, whoa, that's a lot of money, and that could do a lot of good on Earth, which is correct. But the civilian space program is chump change compared to what is already spent on the military or on social programs.
It's very true.
As it is, if say the money that was put into NASA was, say, put into healthcare or something, you know what I would call that? I would call it Friday.
Yeah, but that's a brilliant point. I hadn't actually thought of that before. Because it's true, right? I mean, everyone knows the military is $700 billion, but entitlement programs and social security programs, which hey, I'm all for. I think they're great. That's an even greater percentage than the DoD. That's like cutting funding for PBS because we need a new aircraft carrier. It's like, what are you talking about?
That's right.
That's a very good point. I had never thought about that. Yeah, it's nothing. It's absolutely, we're spending like $1 trillion on Medicare right now. It's what's
That's right.
250?
You know, I mean, because I'm not sure sort of how much literacy, if I could use that word, there is about government spending and government priorities. You know, people know that there's a lot of money spent on various things. But if you stood on a street corner and asked, well, how much of the federal budget is spent on NASA and space, you would get a much higher number from most people than what the reality is, because NASA is a very, very high priority thing, and I would say get a lot of bang for those bucks.
Absolutely.
So anyway, but the priorities are the way they are because the defense is very important to people, and social programs are very important to people, and understandably so. And it takes a bit more judgment to say, well, what's the proper amount to, say, explore Mars or learn about the solar system? But sometimes it pays off. You know, we have our weather satellites, for example, which are very important. GPS, just a monstrous payoff to our economy. You know, if everything in space shut down, it would just be a calamity to the economy around the world. We become very dependent on our infrastructure in space, and we might learn that to our regret a little bit the next time there's a big solar storm.
Absolutely.
I'm a member of the Planetary Society, which was started up by Carl Sagan and people like that, and I just got their magazine in the mail, and it's all about planetary defense. And actually, today is Asteroid Day.
It is.
One of the things that NASA does is looks for rocks flying around in space that have our name on it on them. So we aren't going to have a couple of weeks to send up Bruce Willis and the boys if one gets too close to us. So
not with that attitude. But you're right. Asteroid defense. I mean, could there be anything that outweighs national security and social programs more than finding the bullet that is aimed at humanity's head? Not just shooting, but at least detecting it. I mean, we're walking through no man's land in World War I, blindfolded. And every once in a while we hear the wisp and a crack of a bullet go by, and we go, huh, that one was close. Anyway, we're really concerned with the color of our socks. And it's like, dude, why are we not looking around 360 degrees at all times? And again, I don't know, maybe that's just...
I mean, this is a bit of a tough call for our politicians, because asteroids, it could really be a bad day if one hit us. But the odds of that happening are not all that great. We have other threats to deal with. The climate change is very immediate and very real, and of course, the pandemic has taught us some expensive lessons. There's certainly greater threats in terms of possibilities of them coming up than asteroids, but still there is that threat, and so there has to be at least something of a search going on.
Do you think that there is, from the standpoint of a politician who is on a perpetual campaign to just be reelected, like, let's just put ourselves in their head, is there something that it's just like, why the chances of us getting hit by an asteroid are so small? why divert like funds or why sacrifice jobs from my constituents to go towards asteroid defense? And then secondly, and if it does happen, no one's going to be here to crucify me because we're all going to be vaporized.
Well, I was actually just thinking of an example of that. He's been gone a couple of decades now, but in the latter part of the 20th century, there was a prominent U.S. senator called William Proxmire, and he got a lot of publicity for his budget cutting efforts. And he used to give out this thing called the Golden Fleece Award for various things. And and in a lot of cases, he was right. He would look for stupid government programs or things that weren't providing that much value, or maybe things like people spending a lot of money on their office furniture and things like that. But one of the things he did go after was spending on the search for asteroids, and a couple of other people got in on that. So it has happened and probably will happen. But I can't condemn it completely, because I think everything should be debated from time to time.
Sure.
In important programs, sometimes they aren't as efficient as they could be. So
yeah, I've often thought about, if I was a real snake oil salesman, a real slippery con man, I've often thought that the number one industry to go into would be doomsday prepping, because you could sell bunkers now, and by the time anyone figures out that like the air scrubbers don't work or the gaskets aren't airtight, the only way that you're ever going to be found out to be a fraud is in the case of Armageddon, in which case money will be worthless and you'll probably be dead and no one will be there to come, give you your karma. I don't know. It's if you and I have an apartment together and I decide to save some money by not buying carbon monoxide alarms, how are you going to find out? When we find out, we won't find out because we'll be dead. I don't know. Is that more of a human condition then? I know now we're kind of stretching out into philosophy, but is that more of a human condition where it's like, unless it's an immediate thing, like, if anything, you're just going to be made fun of for spending precious dollars on an asteroid defense program.
Yeah, these are tough calls, but we humans have this great big brain, but in the middle there's that brain stem, which was there in the lizards and the other animals that preceded us in the chain of evolution.
Yep.
And sometimes we kind of react that way,
is the brain
sometimes the threats we see are not the logical thing,
Yeah,
but we're hardwired. For example, the classic example is sort of the worries about the others. People who come from outside or who are different from us, which creates all sorts of problems that I don't think I need to talk about. But some of that is kind of hardwired into us and clouds our judgment a little bit.
Yeah. Well, the same way that sex sells. You go on Instagram and you see a beautiful woman in a bikini and she's selling AirPods, and you're like, hold on, I got the AirPods, but there's no babe. And by the time you realize that you're duped, you're done. Same thing with fear, right? The brainstem is what,
Scare ourselves.
Yeah, we got to scare ourselves. And then in some cases, it's very real, right? You get a Pearl Harbor, you get a 9/11, and it's like, oh, we got to jack up defense spending. But yeah, it's that there are
we had all those bomb shelters during the Cold War.
Exactly.
There's one right across the street, and one of our neighbors built one, and
it's like, how rational is it? Like, what?
Or you have survivalists, in the middle of Wyoming, things like that.
Like, yeah, like what are you aiming to survive? Like, do you like? I mean, I would. What's is it Gorbachev? Was it Gorbachev or Khrushchev? In a nuclear winter, the living will envy the dead. Like, you don't want to be alive.
I think that was Khrushchev, and of course he also said, "We will bury you."
But it's right. But we're still here, and we're going way off into the weeds now. So to kind of cycle it back, you said earlier, right when we started talking, you said I'll touch on it in a couple minutes, and then you and I just rambled for 50 minutes. You said something about your book with the Hubble Telescope. I don't remember what it was. You said we'll touch back on that.
Well, I'm just I just like to say that's a very interesting story, because Hubble was the major telescope for 30 years, still is, but it was a centerpiece of the shuttle program, because Hubble would be long gone by now if it hadn't been serviced by space shuttles. And in fact, there's the famous situation where the mirror, the big mirror, was ground to the wrong shape.
Yeah,
and they were able to exploit the fact that they were going to service the telescope to actually overcome that problem. So 30 years ago, Hubble was a byword for failure. It was there with the Edsel and the Hindenburg and all these other things that went wrong. And a few years later, thanks to the changes that were made in the first shuttle servicing mission, it's now a symbol of American success and technological prowess. So it's quite an interesting story, and so people will, some people will remember the servicing mission, the first servicing mission, but there was 4 others that came along, and it's quite an interesting story.
Yeah. Is on this another thought popping in my head, kind of on a completely different direction, and I believe this was from the Trump administration, maybe it was from before and it continued, but I haven't followed up on it in a couple of years. The successor to the ISS it's LOP-G, LOP-G. Is that still planned, or has that been scrapped? Or was that not even a real thing? Did it just grab headlines? It was called LOP-G. It was something about Lunar Gateway. It was like an ISS.
Oh, the Lunar Gateway. Well, that's part of the Artemis program.
Well, no, maybe I had the wrong term. Going on. Maybe I think I might have just used the wrong term. Maybe it wasn't Lunar Gateway, because I know what that is.
Yeah. So I mean, there's been all sorts of talk about follow-up space stations to the ISS.
Let me try to find it.
But I think there's and where that's going is still, if I can use the expression, up in the air. There's a lot of thought that future space stations are going to be operated by the private sector, and I suspect that's kind of the closest the closest thing to a policy on that right now. But it's still the ISS is still going, and we might be into an interesting situation because the Russians are talking about pulling out. Now, they've been doing that for years, but of course, America's relationship with Russia is not that great these days. So it could happen. It could be that the Russians wind up cooperating more with China. There seems to be some signs of that. So
I just pulled it up. And it is the Trump administration. I don't know this from a couple of years ago. The Trump administration is proposing to formally start a cislunar space station program and begin assembly early in the next decade. It is now named the Lunar Orbital Platform Gateway (LOPG), which
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it was going to be, I think it was going to be, like the Lagrange point or something. It was going to be somewhere like halfway between us and the moon.
I thought it was kind of.
I trust you.
Moving around a little bit.
I trust you. This is your area of expertise. I'm a moron wearing a zebra stripe hoodie. I don't know.
Yeah. So that's kind of part of the Artemis program. I think they're talking about a couple of flights. There'll be one that'll go into lunar orbit. I think there's a robotic one that's going to go in the next year or two, and then there will be one into lunar orbit, and then there will be a landing. And at some point, the lunar gateway will be put in place to permit kind of more regular passage between the moon and the Earth. The lunar gateway would be the place, say, where lunar landers would go, and then at a different point, people would come up from Earth. And anyway, it's all rather complicated. I haven't really kept super close eye on it, and there are some arguments that maybe we could live without the lunar gateway. But anyway, it's still an integral part of Artemis right now, and we'll see how that all unrolls. And there are some of the international partners that are joining in Artemis are also involved in the lunar gateway.
I've got you for 5 more minutes, and I can't resist. What do you think about all the UFO and UAP reports coming out?
Well, these come out from time to time. Yeah. When you just look at the sheer numbers, there's got to be something out there.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
But whether that is a factor in these UFOs, I'm not so sure about that. So
it gets...
I follow it with interest, but I don't consider myself an expert on that.
Well, anyone that says they're an expert,
I was we're coming up on July 4th, and I was just reading something that noted the fact that there's always a spike in UFO sightings around July the 4th, and that has something to do with the fact that you have more people looking in the sky. So, as they say, the truth is out there, and we'll see what happens.
For it to not, light that little curiosity fire in you is just, you don't have a pulse if you don't, have some sort of interest. But it's also the idea that it would be anything that we could conceive it to be. I always think about those uncontacted tribes they find in the Amazon, and I think they found one recently out in somewhere in the Pacific where they've been uncontacted for 60,000 years. They're in loincloths, and whenever anyone tries to go near them, they kill them. And so we go and we approach them with helicopters, and they throw spears at us. You got to look at it from their mindset. Loincloths and spears. And here comes a thing with a glass canopy. It's matte black. It kind of looks like a big insect. It's louder than hell, and it's floating in the air, and to them, that's a UFO. So the idea that a UFO would be anything that we could conceive of, it's, well, how is it going to get here? The speed of light. Well, we also thought the world was flat at one point. We also thought there was no such thing as germ theory. Whatever UFOs are, it's not going to be, I think whatever we think it is can't be correct. So the idea that it's a ship landing here, I think that's flawed. I don't know what it could possibly be, but just like the uncontacted tribes, is there anything we can gain from them? Not really. But is it scientifically curious? Absolutely. why wouldn't an alien species come? We're an uncontacted tribe. They're looking at Earth, and we're in our metaphorical loincloths. They're like, hey, look, they still kill each other. You know, not everybody has health care, and, you know, they're destroying their planet. They'd be curious. At the very least, I think they'd be curious. I don't think I'm going to get any truth in my lifetime, which disappoints me greatly, but there's nothing anyone can do. You said earlier, a minute ago, you said I'm not an expert. Nobody's an expert on UFOs, and if someone is an expert, then they're selling you something. So, yeah, no one knows. The hubris involved with saying you're a UFO expert is just, it's insane. But I had to ask you that, and I appreciate your response. But Dr. Gainor, we are at 1 hour. I will put your book in the description, and I will get your new book on the Hubble telescope, and I'll email you. I'd love to talk to you about that. And again, anybody interested in the missile race or anything leading up to it, it's a highly, highly engaging book. I love it. There are things in there that I didn't know that I learned from your book. Anyone that's remotely interested in anything with the Cold War, I'd say your book is a must-read. It's fantastic. It's terrifying, and it's what it is. It's, hey, we're launching nukes. We're putting nukes on top of missiles and hurling them at each other. It really does come down to the brainstem. It's kind of a book it's a 20th century take on the brainstem.
That's right.
Dr. Gainor, thank you so much, sir. I'll put all the links in the description. And until next time, you take care. God bless. God bless everybody. God bless America. And hopefully we'll get to the moon sooner or later without nuking each other.
That's right.
You have a good one, Dr. Gainor.
Recording stopped.
Bye-bye.